Did you know that in the alpha version of WoW, shields used to have two classification types, shields and bucklers? Hunters and rogues were able to equip bucklers, but then later in alpha, the classification difference was removed, not allowing hunters or rogues to equip shields again. Bucklers still exist in the game, however, they're just classified as shields. Male trolls used to have a joke that said this:
I killed 2 dwarfs in the morning, I killed 2 dwarfs at night, I killed 2 dwarfs in the afternoon, and then I feel alright. I killed 2 dwarfs in time of peace and 2 in time of war. I killed 2 dwarfs before I killed 2 dwarfs, and then I killed 2 more.
This is in reference to the song Smoke 2 Joints by The Toys, later by Sublime. This joke was removed at some points because its association with weed.
Smoke weed every day.
Originally, Ironforge was by far the largest city in the game. It had an entire second floor that you could explore. The inner ring was pretty much a maze with areas such as Night Elf District and Old Town. The center forge definitely looked different. Old Ironforge, which was originally locked up until Cataclysm, was accessible in this version of the city. There seemed to be an elevator that went down to it, and the Deep Room tram, well, it also looked wildly different. The original game director for WoW, Mark Kern, said this on stream once.
Well, we had more races planned in the beginning than we had time to do. There was this huge come to Jesus moment. I think we had like 20 possible races or something ridiculous like that. We ended up cutting a ton of races. And the race that we regretted cutting the most is the Naga.
Highborn Night Elves that fell to the Great Sundering, being corrupted by N'Zoth due to Queen Ashar's immediate allegiance with them, the Naga would have made an interesting race in WoW. But also imagine if WoW did start with 20 races. There are a number of NPCs in WoW that reference celebrities such as Robbie Flay, and Stormwind reference to the chef Bobby Flay. Harris Pilton and Chatrath reference to media personality, businesswoman, model, and many other things Paris Hilton. Caregiver Ofra Windfury, innkeeper in the Temple of Talhamat in Hellfire Peninsula, of course reference to talk show host, actress, and icon Oprah Winfrey. Keanu Reeves and Sky Captain Swayze in the War Master Blackhorn fight in the Dragon Soul Raid, reference to Keanu Reeves and Patrick Swayze in the movie Point Break. Barney Farley and Draenor Nagra in reference to Chris Farley with his iconic dance. The Rock and Chatrath, who's a chef, but it's a reference to actor and wrestler Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, who often talks about cooking. And there's many others out there. There's also a Robin Williams reference in Draenor Nagrand, and another of Mila Kunis in the Monk Legion class hall, both actors who have said to be fans of WoW. In the alpha version of WoW, there were 2 mysterious islands that never made it to live servers. That's the Island of Dr. Lapidus and Gilligam's Isle. Isle of Dr. Lapidus is a reference to former Blizzard employee Alan Lapidus, who was an environmental designer, and Gilligam's Isle is a reference to an American 1960s sitcom, Gilligan's Island. Both of these islands resided off the coast of Westfall and Stranglethorn Vale. They were featured in a 2006 map of the Eastern Kingdoms and even made their way to the original WoW cinematic. There lies a grand unsolved mystery relating to the Dark Moon Fair. This can be explored if you kill your character on the island and wander around it as a ghost. There are ghost NPCs that you can interact with. Franklin Jenner says that he was promised he'd never encounter the horrors of war at the fair. Brendan Paulson saying that for most of his life, the fair was his home. Cup Coin Care talking about his unpaid debt. Arlon Sherhoof speaking of her duties to look over her campsite. Selthera Wellspun, who was just looking for firewood. Martha Weller, who is a deceased nurse, and Zazla that mentioned Silas would keep him safe. Silas Darkmoon is the founder and leader of the fair, but there's no way that he's connected to the murder of these NPCs, right? Or it could very well be this undead witch in the woods which sells various questionable meats like Troll Tartar, Stormwind Surprise, Mulgore meat, and Silvermoon steak. During Alpha WoW, Skullman's was originally going to be just an outdoor elite zone. It was actually so big and good that they decided to go with a dungeon instead. But then later, during the beta, it was actually a 15-person raid, along with Blackrock Spire and Stratholme. These dungeons were so difficult that they decided to just tune them down to 5-player dungeons, except our Blackrock Spire, of course, being a 10-player raid. Still on the topic of Skullman's and staying on the timeline, alchemists could only create flasks at an alchemy lab, and Skullman's was one of the 2 spots in the game with an alchemy table. This was a last minute change during beta. During the beta, Hunter's survival talent tree had a different name called Outdoorsmanship, and Marksman was simply called Ranged Combat. Now, what did make it to live servers was Survival's very dedicated melee talent tree. It had talent options such as increasing melee hit chance, melee crit, as well as melee damage, and also a lacerate ability that did very little damage. This was all changed in patch 1.7 to make Survival pretty much a Marksman 2.0, and then 12 years later, Survival became a strictly melee spec again. Hellfire Peninsula was originally going to be a zone in vanilla. It was labeled as a level 54 to 60 zone. They had an entire skeletal structure of the zone built out. In fact, you could get to a beta testing version of Hellfire Peninsula through dead mines by glitching through a wall, using some goblin gliders, then riding your mount to the Outland testing area, as it was dubbed. During the vanilla beta, dwarves could be mages. This of course came to fruition in Cataclysm. Now staying on the topic of mages, during the beta as well, they had an ability called Khadgar's Unlocking. It was similar to a rogue's lockpicking skill. Also, CCs didn't have reduced time in PvP, which would allow mages to shoot players underwater and cause them to drown. During the beta, patch 0.6 to be exact, Warlock's Banish spell had a 30-minute cooldown. Patch 0.7 reduced that cooldown to 20 minutes. Then beta patch 0.12 removed the cooldown completely. Warlock's class mounts were originally called Nightmare and Alpha. Also, Warlocks were able to kill players in duels a while back by having their imp outs, getting the player to the lowest possible health, dotting them up, then allowing your imp to cast Fireball, and if the dots were able to do enough damage in the very small time frame to defeat the player in the duel, the imp would then finish their cast, killing the player. Oh, and also Warlock's Succubus minions originally had less clothes until patch 1.4. During the beta, Warrior's charge ability would teleport them to the target. This was changed in beta patch 0.6. Also during the beta, Recklessness would decrease the Warrior's armor to 0 when used. Then patch 1.1 changed that to just damage taken. In beta, Recklessness also had a 30-minute cooldown and shared its cooldown with Shield Wall and Retaliation. Much later in Wrath of the Lich King, the cooldown was reduced to 5 minutes and did not share cooldown timers anymore. Back in vanilla, the best warrior DPS gloves were these level 44 male gloves called Edgemaster's Handguards, because they gave weapons skill bonuses. After a patch in vanilla, warriors were accidentally given an extra talent point for a short while. This allowed them to spec into both Mortal Strike and Death Wish, becoming very overpowered. Originally, a rogue's eviscerate ability had a base damage which did not scale, so a rogue with no gear on would have their eviscerate do just as much damage as a rogue with a decked out gear set. Rogues had a mace specialization talent which had a chance to stun targets. This was changed to ignoring the enemy's armor in Wrath of the Lich King. Rogues' poisons used to have charges, meaning that sometimes they'd have to reapply them during boss fights. Rogues also used reagents to craft their poisons and had to keep them in their bag. In addition to this, they needed to purchase flash powder for Vanish and blinding powder for Blind. Needless to say, they had very little bag space to work with. During the beta, Druids had a Feign Death style ability while in cat form. Also during the beta, Shamans were actually the ones who had a combat resurrect, and it wasn't Druids. By release, it was given to Druids since Shamans were a horde only class. Back in vanilla, you couldn't see other players casting bars, so Druids would commonly use their Hearthstone ability to bait out interrupts so they could heal. During vanilla, Balanced Druid was the worst DPS spec. Patch 1.8 added Moonkin form, but they were still bad. Originally, Priest's Inner Fire spell, which was removed in Warlords, would increase the caster's attack power. This was because Discipline Priests were originally going to be a melee spec similar to how Monks turned out. Patch 1.10 made it increase armor with 20 charges. During the beta, Priests, in addition to Mages, had a sleep spell. This was removed in beta patch 0.8. In Shattrath, there is an NPC next to Harris Pilton that only Priests can see if they equip the Eye of Divinity. This NPC is Nicole Ritchie, reference to Nicole Ritchie, a friend of Paris Hilton. Back in vanilla, Priests would get 2 different abilities based on their race. Undead would get Touch of Weakness and Devouring Plague. Trolls would get Hex of Weakness and Shadow Guard. Night Elves would get Star Shards and Elun's Grace. Humans would get Desperate Prayer and Feedback, and Dwarves would get Desperate Prayer and Fear Ward. In Burning Crusade, Fear Ward was given to all Priests and replaced with Chastise for Dwarves. Then in Wrath of the Lich King, a couple of these became baseline to Priests and the rest were removed. In addition to being able to wear bucklers, Hunters were the final class that were introduced into beta. Arcane Shot would scale with spell damage. This is why the Hunter tier 2.5 set, which is from AQ40, would have spell damage on it. Speaking of spell damage, there was a hunter by the name of Airness on the EU realm Throckferoth who stacked spell damage gear and buffs specifically for Manpet and soloed the world boss Azure Ghost. During vanilla, if hunters stayed the 6-minute duration of Feigned Death, they would actually die. This was changed in Burning Crusade. Also, during TBC, hunters could macro their entire rotation to a single button. You just have to change cast sequence to whatever the attack speed of your current ranged weapon was. Steady Shot and Kill Command is really all a hunter needed back then. Paladin's Blessings used to only last 5 minutes, and you had to individually place them. So by the time they got done buffing an entire 40-man raid in vanilla, they'd have to start rebuffing again. Reckoning was a talent that protection paladins could pick. Each time the paladin received a critical hit, they would get a stack, which would make their next auto attack do another hit. This originally could be infinitely stacked and was referred to as a Reckoning Bomb. This was utilized to kill the world boss Kazakh and then promptly hotfix within 24 hours to stack up to 4. Pallies have had a total of 12 seals: Seal of Fury, which turned into Righteous Fury, Crusader, Blood, or Martyr depending on your faction, Corruption or Vengeance depending on your faction, Command, which was removed then later brought back, Light, Wisdom, Truth, Insight, Righteousness, and Justice. Originally, Shaman's Earthbind Totem had no cooldown, allowing them to infinitely kite. It was given a 15-second cooldown in patch 1.2. Shaman's Reincarnation spell would originally cause Res Sickness. This was changed in patch 1.3. Also around this time, Enhancement Shamans had a talent which allowed them to use two-handed axes and maces. If they ever did a talent respec, they would lose all of their weapon skill for those. Storm Strike could be stacked on a target multiple times, increasing the nature damage that target takes. This was utilized by a player stacking as much spell damage as possible to chain lightning the target, causing one of the biggest crits in vanilla WoW, 25k. There was going to be another battleground implemented during vanilla called Ashar Crater. It was an Alterac Valley style battleground taking place in the Forlorn Ridge of Ashara. It was first announced around patch 1.3, but they came to the conclusion that it wasn't ready yet. It was revisited at BlizzCon 2007 when they announced Wrath of the Lich King, where they said it was put on the back burner because Alterac Valley was not very well tuned and that was a higher priority.
But there's also an arena set up in Ashara. What was that arena going to be?
Right, that was the one we call Ashara Crater, just before we really kind of learned the lessons from Alterac Valley. And I've never really felt comfortable going forward with Ashara Crater until we finally feel like, you know what, Alterac Valley really works the way we'd like it to work.
Players began to lose hope with the release of Kata since the Bilgewater Goblins completely strip mined the Forlorn Ridge. But they gained hope again at BlizzCon 2011 when it was mentioned that Ashar Crater was one of the 3 battlegrounds being considered to be added to the Mists of Pandaria expansion. Except they didn't add it and added Temple of Kamugu and Silvershard Mines instead. During the alpha, there was a profession called Survival Skills. This allowed the player to craft torches and campfires, which was of course later given to cooking. There were basic campfires that gave players 4 spirits, and bright campfires which gave players 8 spirits, and players were expected to use these skills after each battle to faster regenerate health and mana. Originally, some of the darker zones such as Duskwood would require a torch to see further in the distance. You'd be able to craft an unlit torch with the skill and then use it on a campfire to light it, and the lit torch would also give players around you a small bonus such as 4 stamina. During a live stream, Mark Hurd said this regarding the original direction of how they were going to handle death in WoW.
When you died in WoW, originally, you were supposed to go to the Emerald Dream. And you were supposed to meet NPCs who had died in the lore of Warcraft, and they would give you quests that you could only do in the Emerald Dreaming. You could go back and find a spirit guide to bring you back, or you could stay there and complete quests there.
Before Shadowlands was a blip on anyone's radar, the Emerald Dream was seen as the one and only afterlife. There have been talks about having an Emerald Dream themed expansion for years, and maybe one day it'll come to fruition. Who knows? During the beta, patch 0.8, Tauren had a racial ability called Plains Running. This was supposed to act as the racial mounts for Tauren before they decided on Kodos, and it did have the same movement speed as a normal and epic mount. How Plains Running worked is that the Tauren had to be running for 10 seconds for it to kick in, but if they were damaged at all, they would lose the movement speed buff. It also had a big issue, and that was if the Tauren stopped moving at all, they would also lose the movement speed bonus. This is in contrast to the mounts in Vanilla, which had a 3-second cast time and typically dismounted once dazed. These limitations were primarily done so Plains Running wasn't overpowered in PvP, but it was just too difficult to balance, so it was removed with the release of the game. But then 6 years later, with the release of Worgen, it was done much more successfully. The first legendary that ever dropped in WoW is the Talisman of Binding Shard. card from Molten Core off Baron Geddon by the character Noctin on the US realm Archimon. Except the only problem with it is that this neck piece was never intended on player use and wasn't supposed to drop in the first place. It was a test item that GMs used for the Thunder Fury quest line, but when the bindings were added, they forgot to take this legendary off the loot table. When Blizzard noticed that this piece was looted, they actually let Noctin keep it. Much later down the line, Noctin realm changed to Blackrock and changed their name to Savorks. Players also noticed that it didn't look like they had a neck piece equipped when looking them up in the armory, speculating that this neck may have been completely removed from the player. And as of making this video, looking them up yields no results, leaving this legendary a mystery. The man himself, Chris Metzen, has served a plethora of roles for Blizzard prior to his current creative advisory role. He began as an artist in 1994 working on Warcraft Orcs and Humans, then later became a story designer for Warcraft 2 Tides of Darkness, then becoming the creative director for Warcraft 3 Reign of Chaos. He was also credited with being the creative director for other Blizzard titles such as Overwatch, StarCraft, and Diablo. Prior to his retirement in 2016, the final piece of Warcraft he worked on was the intro cinematic for Battle for Azeroth. On December 15th, 2022, it was announced that Chris was coming out of retirement to be the creative advisor for World of Warcraft. He's voiced a number of characters such as Thrall, Vol'jin, Varian Wrynn, Arcadus, Nefarian, Ragnaros, both Starfangs, Kazakh, Zul'jin, and even Nalak. Warcraft Adventures Lord of the Clans is a point-and-click Warcraft game that was in development by Blizzard Entertainment and Animation Magic from 1996 to 1998. You played as Thrall, and the premise was that it took place after Warcraft 2 and you're trying to escape the Orcish internment camps following the Horde's defeat from the Alliance. It was delayed past its 1997 release date so they could bring video game designer Steve Maritsky on board to revise the project. Cost constraints and time delays prevented Steve from doing the improvements he truly wanted, so the project was ultimately cancelled in 1998. Before going defunct shortly after this project, Animation Magic created such classics as Link, The Faces of Evil, and Zelda, The Wand of Gamelon.
How about a kiss for luck?
You've got to be kidding.
Player housing is a concept that WoW players have been talking about ever since the beginning of the game, it feels like. It was tested in the alpha version of the game but was completely scrapped. During the beta, there was an NPC in Stormwind named Alexander Lifebringer, who would sell an item called a guild house for 100 gold, which presumably would be used as an instance location for guild members to meet up. There used to be a gated off instance portal between the Old Town and Trade District of Stormwind that was specifically used for player housing, but it was removed in Cataclysm. In 2019, during patch 8.2, the topic of housing came back up, to which Blizzard said that it was still on their minds, but they didn't want it to feel clumsy. The latest we've heard about player housing was in 2022, prior to the release of Dragonflight, where Blizzard pretty much said that it wasn't coming soon, and it would require a large overhaul of the game engine for it to be freely customizable and not just a Garrison 2.0. Former team lead of WoW, Mark Curd, has also said this on stream.
I really wanted a collectible card game mini-game in World of Warcraft. And the idea was you could play it anywhere. You could sit down at a campfire out there or whip out a deck of cards and start playing with somebody else. I wanted you to loot cards from mobs out in the world to fill your deck. And when you got into the inn, if I sat down at one of these tables across from somebody else, it would be ranked. So the inns would be places you would go to get ranked play. Same with boats, because boat rides were meant to be pretty long.
Canonically, Hearthstone does take place in an inn with its innkeeper Hearthstone Brew. Development for Hearthstone began in 2008 with some of the company like Chris Metzen and Mike Morhaime excited about the project, but others were skeptical. Senior art director at Blizzard, Samwise Didier, created the first artwork for Pandaren. The image you see on the screen now is that piece of art, designed by Didier. It was originally not intended to be a race in Warcraft, but was created as a Christmas picture for his daughter. It had such a huge response from Blizzard fans when it was turned into a wallpaper that Didier couldn't believe it. In 2002, Blizzard had an April Fool's joke where Pandaren would be the 5th playable race to Warcraft 3, but this left many fans disappointed when they found out that it was just a joke. Pandaren were eventually added as a neutral NPC in Warcraft 3 Reign of Chaos, sharing the same model as Furbolgs. Then in the Warcraft 3 expansion, The Frozen Throne, a Pandaren neutral hero was finally added, with Chen Stormstout being an optional hero in the bonus campaign. During a 2011 BlizzCon Q&A for the Mists of Pandaria expansion, Chris Metzen revealed that Pandaren were going to be the Alliance race in Burning Crusade, but was scrapped halfway through for Draenei.
I'll tell you what, no one knows this, the pandas were actually going to be the Alliance race in Burning Crusade.
In 2004, Blizzard had an April Fool's joke announcing that two-headed ogres would be a playable race in WoW. They would be operated by two players, each controlling one half of the ogre. When one player logged out, that ogre's head would show as sleeping. Now this was quickly seen by the community as impractical and a joke, but what fooled many players was Blizzard's 2007 April Fool's joke, which detailed the Black Temple attunement. Prior to the release of Black Temple, patch 2.1, Blizzard revealed how players would get attuned for the raid and described it as big as the opening of the gates of AQ. You'd start out by talking to a Kama in Shadowmoon Valley, and you'd have to reach Revered with the Ash-Tongue Death Swarm. Becoming anything more than friendly was actually impossible at this point. A long chart was released showing all that you had to do to open up Black Temple. Once this chart was shown to the public, this April Fool's joke was dealt with swiftly. But one that fooled the entire player base was the April Fool's joke of 2008, where Blizzard announced a Bard class to the Wrath of the Lich King expansion. This is a class players still mention to this day, and maybe one day it'll happen. Death Knight was a class planned to be released with vanilla, considering it was already in the Warcraft universe, but was scrapped as there was not enough of them in lore at the time, and they were seen as antagonists. When brainstorming for Wrath, Necromancers and Rune Masters were considered to be added along with Death Knights. They decided to mesh the Necromancer diseases and Rune Master's rune resource into one hero class, the Death Knight. China plays a heavily censored version of WoW, so any mention of death is removed. Death Knights are referred to as Fade Knights, with abilities like Fade Coil and Fade and Decay. As previously mentioned, China does play a heavily censored version of WoW. Not only can death not be mentioned, but the physical appearance of protruding bones can't either. Sometimes they get lazy with it. Instead of changing the appearance of a skull, they just sit a stack of hay on top of it. Abominations have their stomachs sewn up, flesh sprawled across the ground is turned into bread and hay, and skeletons lying around are turned into straw men. Even Sapphiron, the second to last boss in Nax, is given a normal fleshy blue drake model. Icecrown has a number of changes to it, as you'd imagine. The ground typically has a skull pattern on it, but in China, it's all swept away. The bone mounds leading up to Lord Morrigar look like big lumps of rocks, and Lord Morrigar himself still kind of looks skeletal, but his multiple heads are really the only difference. Festergut and Rotface look more like dwarven behemoths, something you might imagine in Storm Peaks. And the Lich King's trusty sidekick, Sindragosa, is also given a normal blue drake model like Sapphiron. Undead almost didn't make the cut in vanilla, being the last race to be added. In lore, they did join the Horde late in the game. During Alpha, Undead were able to speak Common, allowing them to speak with Alliance. And then during the Beta, Forsaken were actually labeled as Undead, allowing them to be hit by abilities like Exorcism and Holy Wrath, but also being immune to Polymorph and Fear effects. The most popular Horde race class combination in vanilla was the Undead Rogue. In fact, when race changes were introduced in 2009, so many Horde players rushed to race change to Undead for Will of the Forsaken that it was nerfed a few days later to share a 45-second cooldown with the Horde PvP trinket. Orcs were one of two of the first races that Blizzard added. Also, there was a period during Burning Crusade where Orcs' shoulder armor appeared twice as small. It took Blizzard a couple months to fix it for whatever reason. At the start of vanilla, Orcs' Blood Fury talents would only increase melee attack bar by 25% for 15 seconds, but then would decrease their base attack bar by 25% for 45 seconds. This was changed in patch 1.9 to instead reduce the effectiveness of healing by 50% for 25 seconds instead of the attack power penalty. In Burning Crusade, Blood Fury had different versions based on your class to increase melee attack power, or spell power, making it more useful to classes like Warlocks and Hunters. The healing penalty was then later removed in Wrath of the Lich King. This is the first iteration of the female troll model in Alpha. Looks a little scary. During Burning Crusade, there was a troll warrior named Gutrot to achieve the feat of leveling from 1 to 70 with no gear or weapons and only having rings, necklaces, and trinkets on. It took him 32 days of game time. Trolls were kind of known for just having the weakest racials in vanilla. Even Berserking, which is seen today as a very good racial, had its flaws at the start of the game. Originally, it would increase your attack speed by 25% but could only be used when the player was at a very low health. Patch 1.4 changed it to being able to be used when the player received a critical hit, still on a 3-minute cooldown, but in addition, the player's damage taken would be increased by 10%. Patch 1.9 redesigned it to its final classic iteration of being able to be used whenever on a 3-minute cooldown, and it would increase the player's attack speed by 10 to 30% based on their missing health. Wrath of the Lich King changed it to just give a flat 20% haste, and then much later in WoD it was nerfed to 15% with a further nerf in BFA to 10%. In addition to having the planes running skill in beta, there was a wandering Tauren in Stranglethorn Vale named Samantha Swifthoof, who was originally supposed to teach planes running, but had no use on live servers. She was removed in Cataclysm, perished to Deathwing. Female Taurens, being more upright than male Tauren, could not fit through many doors, including the Molten Core skip window by the High Elf Questgiver. Tauren got their name by being an anagram of nature, and as of recording this video, Tauren are tied with the most race class combinations, with Zandalari trolls just not being able to be demon hunters. During vanilla, humans could not be hunters, which seemed very strange. This was changed in Cataclysm. Humans have appeared in every Warcraft-based game, fighting the orcs in Warcraft 1 and 2, as well as trying to stop the plague in Warcraft 3. In lore, humans were created as sort of a deformed version of the Vrykul that didn't take too kindly to the curse of flesh. Those Vrykul, which lived in Northrend, were told to kill their deformed children, but many couldn't bring themselves to do that, so they escaped and brought them to northern eastern kingdoms. It's speculated that the first human on Azeroth was Ronan, since he traveled into the past to the War of the Ancients, and the Night Elves didn't know what to make of him. They thought he was some strange variation of a dwarf. Night Elf guards in Darnassus are all female, but with the Night Elf Heritage Armor quest, Sentinels have opened up to males as well, which you can see in Belemeth. In Vanilla and Burning Crusade, Sylvanas used a Night Elf model instead of our current Undead High Elf model. During Alpha, the park area in Stormwind was just called the Night Elf District. The voice of the female Night Elf is Debbie Mae West, who voiced a number of roles in various animes, animated shows, and video games. One of her more prominent roles is Marilyn Silverberg in the Metal Gear series. The voice actor for the male Night Elf is not yet known. If you were a Dwarf Priest in Vanilla, you were almost guaranteed a raid spot because of Fear Ward. The spell icon for Blink is actually a dwarf blinking, but dwarfs weren't able to be mages until Cataclysm. Stoneform has been seen as a very important racial, especially in PvP. During Vanilla, it would grant immunity to bleed, poison, and disease effects for 8 seconds, as well as increasing armor by 10%. With the release of Wrath and Death Knights with it, Stoneform was nerfed to instead just remove any of those effects if they were on you. To compensate, its cooldown was reduced from 3 minutes to 2. Cataclysm made it so it would instead reduce your damage taken by 10% instead of the armor buff. It was then buffed in Warlords to remove any magic or curses in addition to the other effects. And then to compensate for that buff, it instead reduced physical damage taken by 10% instead of all damage. And then in patch 6.1, it shared a 30-second cooldown with PvP trinkets. Prior to patch 3.1, players were automatically dismounted if their mount entered the swim animation in water. Because of this, gnomes would automatically get dismounted once they enter shallow water in Zangarmarsh or Swamp of Sorrows. Gnomes are the only playable race where the male and females share the same animation skeleton. Prior to 2014, gnomes were the only original race to not be featured in any WoW cinematic or trailer. Former game director Tom Chilton said that it was because they were added late in development, and the original cinematic was already in full production. This was until a gnome was featured in one of the Warlords of Draenor trailers, showing off the character boost. Prior to their introduction in the Mists of Pandaria expansion, there were monks that still appeared in World of Warcraft, such as named NPCs like Lefty in Blackrock Depths and Aramis Blightblaze in Magister's Terrace. There were even Condemned monks, Scarlet monks, Aconine monks, and even Argent monks. During beta testing, Chi-Ji was going to be the August Celestial that aligned with Mistweavers. However, red healing spells were confusing to players, so it was changed to Yu'lon. This is the first snapshot of the World of Warcraft website, taken in October of 2001, 3 years before the game came out. A later snapshot of the website still before the game's release looked like this, where they had sections to download various trailers and wallpapers. Even a town hall section showing off the original 8 races, as well as a world map that looked like this, with notable locations like Ashenvale Forest, not just Ashenvale, and Mount Hyjal, which wasn't accessible by conventional means in vanilla. Also the subcontinents of the Eastern Kingdom. We had Lordaeron, Cosmodon, and Azeroth.